In a few moments, we'll be hearing an address from Governor Hammond in his speech before this special session of the 11th Alaska State Legislature, which convened today in Juneau, September 22nd, 1980. The House and Senate did go into session at 10 o'clock this morning, which is the usual meeting time, but after a reference of 10 bills to the Finance Committee, all related to tax relief, the House did adjourn, and they have now gone back into session. The Senate will join them in the House chambers. All 60 members will sit in these chambers and listen to Governor Hammond's speech, which is to be from 7 to 8 minutes long.
Under the uniform rules of the Alaska State Legislature, the President of the Senate presides during a joint session. This time it's my, hopefully, well, near to the last, pleasure to turn over the gavel to President Tillian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that you won't see me too often up here in the future. A little decorum from the ranks, please. Will joint session please come to order? Senator Kurtula.
President, I would move the roll call be waived and all members of the Senate be showed as present.
Hearing no objections, so ordered. Representative Anderson.
Mr. President, I move that the roll call for the House be waived and all members be shown as present.
Hearing no objections, so ordered.
Did you restore?
Firepoint silver. I don't see. No, let's just take Dankford for killing.
Senate President Clem Tillian and House Speaker Terry Gardner will now select a member of each body to go to the governor's office on the 3rd floor and escort the governor down to the House of Representatives on the 2nd floor so that Governor Hammond may make his prepared speech. A copy of the speech has been distributed to members of the press, and in the brief message, Governor Hammond proposes again his idea for not a repeal, but a suspension of Alaska state taxes until 1990. And he pushes this idea, although many members of both the Senate and the House have preferred an outright repeal, as was proposed by House Republicans early in the regular session last year. Presently, the state income tax nets for the state about $130 million. In March, the House approved the suspension that Governor Hammond is now proposing again, and also approved a $350 flat payment to all residents who are 18 years or older. As we all well know, those are not the final bills that came out of the legislature this year. Instead, we had a tax refund system based on years of residency, with 1/3 of your income tax being suspended for each year that you lived here, of course, up until 3 years. Also devised was a permanent fund dividend program based on years that one has lived in the state since statehood, with $50 for each year going to residents who have lived here at least 1 year. Those two pieces of legislation were challenged by Ron and Penny Zogel, and recently the state Supreme Court ruled that the tax relief legislation was unconstitutional because it implicitly required durational residency. The High Court has not yet released an opinion on the permanent fund dividend program, and Governor Hammond will encourage in his speech for the House and Senate only to work with and deal with tax relief measures during this special session, rather than trying to tackle a permanent fund dividend distribution program. However, in his speech today, Governor Hammond will reveal that he has such a bill ready to go, which would provide a flat payment, and he suggests $250 to each Alaska resident, rather than giving $50 for each year of residency. He says this bill is ready and that he will introduce it if there is a consensus among Senate and House members that such a measure should be considered this week. While there is apparently no constitutional requirement as to the length of the session, it's likely that it will last at least 3 days.
This time it gives me great pleasure to turn the podium over to you for a lengthy, I suppose, message.
Now, hopefully the brevity of this message will set the tone and the pace for this special session. In recognition of the expressed desire of most legislators to confine our deliberations exclusively to remedying legal defects currently denying tax relief, I've limited this special session call to that issue only. Legislation I will introduce will provide Alaskan income taxpayers with as much or more tax relief than that they would have to date been, or than that they have to date been denied by legal action. This special session is necessitated only by the obligation to provide the tax relief promised last session. Had we been permitted to fulfill that promise, we would not have called one to deal with any other issue. Thus, in the interest of time and fiscal responsibility, I urge you to confine your deliberations to that matter only. Should you do so, it's possible to conclude our business in no more than 3 days. Each additional day, of course, will simply delay the time we can mail out refund checks. To address this single issue of tax relief, I'm submitting a single bill. This measure would fully refund both 1979 and 1980 state personal income taxes and suspend the tax until 1990. At that time, the suspension would continue automatically if recurrent income for the immediately preceding fiscal year was sufficient to meet that year's general fund expenditures. Only should recurrent income prove less than adequate would the suspension be lifted and the tax reimposed, unless, of course, the 1990 legislature elected to continue suspension. I'm vitally concerned that by 1990, we have contained government operations to the level we can pay for without reimposing crippling taxes. And those who share that concern should insist upon such a scheduled review and permit automatic continuation of tax suspension or repeal only if by 1990 we have sufficient recurrent revenues to fund recurrent government operations. There could be no greater inducement to achieving that healthy objective than the specter of income tax reimposition should we fail to exercise sufficient self-discipline. Some suggest that taxes paid prior to 1979 should also be refunded. The Attorney General advises that such action would present constitutional problems. Other proposals to disperse additional revenue have also been rumored. Pending a court ruling on the permanent fund dividend, it is premature to take up consideration of most of it. Should the permanent fund dividend be sustained, it will, in conjunction with tax relief, disperse almost $400 million this year alone. On the other hand, should the court rule adversely, most alternatives which might inject a comparable amount into our economy require more time for deliberation than a special session permits. Prudence suggests it's far better to wait until after the court decision so that we can be assured that whatever we do does not come back to haunt us. However, should the majority wish to disperse oil wealth benefits to others than only taxpayers, as would the permanent fund dividend, there is one means by which such might be accomplished without doing violence to the above considerations. Each resident could be tendered, say, a $250 dividend for this year only. Later, should the permanent fund dividend be sustained by the court, each citizen would receive a second check for the balance of the permanent fund dividend they still had coming. This approach would cost little more than that required to fund the original dividend program. On the other hand, should the court strike down the program, we will have at least provided a Zobel-proof means of legally and equitably dispersing some benefits this year to all Alaskans. While I have prepared such a bill for your consideration, in keeping with my statement that I would limit my call to tax relief only, I will not add this to the call unless there is clear consensus to do so. I'm well aware of the pressure upon you from some interest groups to override vetoes which give them distress. As you recall, during the regular session, I discussed with many of you both policy and financial concerns which, if exceeded, might incur a veto. Though I did not cut the ensuing budget nearly so much as would have been required to strictly adhere to those guidelines, I did make a modest reduction of $26.8 million and a record legislative appropriation of $2.1 billion. That's excluding appropriations for loans, native claim payments, and the $900 million placed in the permanent fund. These vetoes amount to but 1.3% of the total. I understand that the heaviest override pressure comes from local governments. Some go so far as to assert that unless my vetoes are overridden, they'll be forced to raise taxes. Collectively, money conveyed by the state to municipalities increased 48.7% since 1979. In light of such substantial increases, one would presume reductions rather than increases might be passed on to municipal taxpayers. That such may not be the case should compel us to re-examine closely the whole issue of revenue sharing. In order not to prolong or disrupt this special session, I urge you to resist pressures to override vetoes. To do otherwise will make it evident we simply cannot stay within even the most modest spending limitations. Should we be unable to so discipline ourselves, it will demonstrate to the public the need to provide, by constitutional mandate and other mechanisms, means of preventing runaway government growth. Our prime mission is clear, and that is to remedy legal defects in past efforts to provide tax relief, period. If ever the possibility of meeting a time limit existed, and that time is now. And I want you to be assured that I'll do everything within my power to help you do so. Thank you.
That was Governor J.S. Hammond speaking to the joint session of this special session of the Alaska State Legislature, which convened in Juneau this morning to consider the issue of tax relief following the state Supreme Court's decision that the initial bill passed granting tax relief based on residency was unconstitutional. It's likely now that the House and Senate will split up and go back to the Senate will go back to its respective chamber down the hall on the second floor of the state capitol, and it's likely that each body will meet just briefly and then adjourn for much of the day. Probably only two committees will be activated during the special session: the Finance Committee, to which 10 bills were referred at least on the House side today, and the Rules Committee, which funnels legislation from other committees to the calendar of both the House and the Senate. As I was saying earlier, while there appears to be no constitutional requirement that the legislature meet for a minimum number of days, as there is a requirement that they cannot meet for more than 30 days in a special session, the bill process will likely cause this session to be a minimum of 3 days. All but one member of the House was present this morning, and that was Joe McKinnon. There are 9 so-called lame duck representatives and senators coming back. Those are legislators who have lost their primary re-election bid and will not be returning next year. I noticed in the galleries this morning some of those candidates who beat present incumbents and who came down to visit and see what the session is all about. In Governor Hammond's address, which he just concluded, he suggested that the session focus only on some sort of tax relief. He suggested a suspension of state income tax until 1990, when, if it's determined that recurrent revenues are sufficient to fund the next year's budget, that it would again be suspended. But if there was not enough money to fund state operations, then the state income tax would automatically kick back in. This is Lori Roberts from the special session.